The year was 1944. It was the first week of September. Across the ocean, the Second World War was raging toward its bloody climax. But in the American Midwest, in the quiet, industrious city of Mattoon, Illinois, the war was a distant reality heard only over crackling radio broadcasts and read in the morning papers. Mattoon was a quintessential homefront town. It was a hub of railroads, heavy manufacturing, and diesel engine plants. The people here were practical, hard-working, and deeply grounded in reality. It was a place where neighbors knew each other, where a strange car on the street was immediately noticed, and where the nights were silent and safe. But that silence was shattered on the night of September 1st. The town was suddenly plunged into a localized nightmare that seemed to defy all logic and reason. An unseen assailant began moving from house to house under the cover of darkness, allegedly pumping an unknown, paralyzing gas through open bedroom windows. Victims reported the same chilling sequence of events. First, the cloying, sickeningly sweet odor. Then, a creeping numbness in the lower extremities, followed by a burning sensation in the mouth and throat, nausea, and partial paralysis that could last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. The panic that followed was absolute. Men patrolled the streets with shotguns. Children were locked in interior rooms. The local police department was completely overwhelmed, chasing shadows in the night. And then, just as suddenly as the attacks began, they stopped. The gas dissipated. The prowler vanished into the mist of history. What happened in Mattoon, Illinois in the autumn of 1944? The official story tells us that there was never any danger. Authorities and scholars have long concluded that the entire ordeal was an illusion. But when you open the sealed archives, when you read the original police blotters, and when you examine the physical evidence left behind, a different, far more disturbing picture begins to emerge. What is the official story, and why does it fail to explain the physical remnants of the night? If the monster was only in their minds, who left the footprints in the mud? To understand the mystery, we must first look at the accepted truth. For nearly 80 years, the events of Mattoon have been studied not by criminologists, but by psychologists. The mainstream official explanation for the mad gasser is that he never existed. According to the official historical record, the town of Mattoon fell victim to one of the most severe and well-documented cases of mass psychogenic illness, commonly known as mass hysteria, in modern human history. The explanation is grounded in the deep psychological strain of the era. In 1944, America was exhausted by war. Nearly every family in Mattoon had a son, a brother, or a husband fighting overseas. The newspapers were filled with stories of death, destruction, and the horrific use of chemical weapons in the European and Pacific theaters. The citizens were living in a constant state of subconscious dread. The official narrative states that this simmering anxiety simply needed a spark. That spark occurred on the evening of September 1st, when a woman named Llewellyn reported a strange smell and a feeling of paralysis in her home. Her husband was away, working the late shift driving a taxi. She was a mother alone with her young daughter. When she smelled the odor, she panicked. She called the police, and more importantly, she told her story to the local newspaper, the Mattoon Daily Journal-Gazette. The newspaper ran the story with a sensational, terrifying headline: "Anesthetic Prowler on Loose." The official theory argues that this headline acted as a psychological trigger. Once the idea of a phantom gasser was planted in the minds of an already anxious public, the power of suggestion took over. A drafty window, the smell of a neighbor's trash burning, or the exhaust from a passing truck was suddenly interpreted as a deadly gas attack. The physical symptoms, numbness, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, were entirely real, but they were the result of severe panic attacks, not chemical exposure. By September 12th, the local police chief, C.E. Cole, issued a statement officially dismissing the attacks. He claimed the odors were carried on the wind from local industrial plants, and that the panic was entirely manufactured by the press and the public's imagination. State authorities agreed. The case was closed. The official stamp of mass hysteria was applied to the files, and the history books were written. It was just a trick of the mind. The accepted truth is that Mattoon was terrified of a ghost of its own making. But a deeper investigation reveals cracks in this perfect psychological explanation. It is easy to write off a terrified town as hysterical from the comfort of a modern armchair. It is much harder to explain away the physical, tangible anomalies that were discovered on those dark September nights. Mass hysteria does not pick locks. Mass hysteria does not cut window screens. The first major discrepancy lies in the timeline itself. While Llewellyn is often cited by psychologists as the patient zero of the hysteria outbreak on September 1st, the police records show she was not the first victim. 2 days earlier, on August 31st, a man named Urban Rafe awoke in the early hours of the morning feeling violently ill. He tried to get out of bed, only to find his legs completely paralyzed. His wife, assuming it was a sudden illness, tried to call a doctor, but she too was overcome by a sweet, nauseating odor and collapsed. Later that same night, a young mother named Beulah Cordes was awakened by her baby crying. She noticed a strange, sweet smell. Believing something was burning in the kitchen, she got up to investigate. As she walked down the hallway, the invisible gas hit her like a physical wall. Her legs gave out. She fell to the floor, unable to move, her throat burning. Neither Urban Rafe nor Beulah Cordes had read a newspaper headline about a gasser. There had been no gossip. There was no widespread panic yet. They experienced identical, highly specific neurological symptoms in complete isolation. How does a psychological contagion spread before the idea of it even exists? Furthermore, the physical evidence gathered at the scenes directly contradicts the theory of a purely mental phenomenon. When police arrived at the Carney residence on September 1st, they did not just find a frightened woman. They found a window screen that had been deliberately slashed from the outside with a sharp blade. The cut was placed exactly where someone would need to reach in to unlatch the window. The officers also found something else in the damp earth just beneath the slashed screen. Clear, deep footprints. Someone had stood there, shifting their weight, right outside the bedroom, and they left behind a crucial, forgotten piece of evidence. Laying in the grass was a woman's white cloth handkerchief. It did not belong to the family. When a police officer picked it up, he reported that it was completely saturated with an unknown liquid. The liquid smelled overwhelmingly sweet, like a cheap, heavy perfume, masking something metallic and chemical. Footprints, slashed screens, a chemically soaked rag. These are not the symptoms of anxiety. These are the tools of a prowler. The narrative of mass hysteria begins to look less like a medical diagnosis and more like a convenient way to close a case that was becoming completely unmanageable. Let us methodically re-examine the nights that followed the Carney attack. By the first week of September, Mattoon was a town under siege. The reports were flooding into the police station. Let us methodically re-examine the nights that followed the Carney attack. By the first week of September, Mattoon was a town under siege. The reports were flooding into the police station. The attacker was not striking randomly. The attacks were concentrated in specific residential corridors, moving logically from one neighborhood to the next across different nights. The method of operation was highly consistent. The prowler approached homes late at night, targeting ground-floor bedroom windows. The victims almost universally reported hearing a faint noise just before the gas entered the room. Some described it as a quiet humming, like a small motorized pump. Others heard the distinct hiss of a pressurized canister being opened. Then, there were the eyewitnesses. Psychologists claim no one ever saw the gasser. This is factually incorrect. On the night of September 5th, a man named Carl Cordes returned home from work late. As he approached his house, he saw a figure lurking in the shadows near his bedroom window. Cordes gave chase, but the intruder was fast, sprinting away down a dark alley. Cordes described the man as tall, dressed entirely in dark clothing, and wearing a tight-fitting cap. The next night, another family reported seeing a tall man dressed in black fleeing their property just after the sickly sweet smell filled their home. Police arrived within minutes. They found the air still thick with the chemical odor. They found fresh footprints. They even found a skeleton key lying in the dirt near the window, a tool commonly used to bypass old-fashioned door locks. If this was a real man, what weapon was he using? The chemical profile is fascinating and disturbing. Experts at the time, and modern chemists who have reviewed the archival descriptions, point out that the symptoms align perfectly with the effects of specific industrial anesthetic compounds. Chemicals like trichloroethylene or chloropicrin. Trichloroethylene is a sweet-smelling, volatile liquid used as an industrial solvent. Inhaling its vapors causes exactly the symptoms reported: a sweet taste, dizziness, nausea, and temporary paralysis of the lower limbs. In 1944, Mattoon was a center of heavy industry. There were diesel plants and manufacturing facilities scattered across the town. Trichloroethylene was not an exotic, hard-to-find chemical. It was a common, everyday solvent used by the gallon to degrease machine parts in the factories just a few blocks away from where the victims slept. The police chief, C.E. Cole, initially believed in the prowler. His officers were finding footprints. They were smelling the gas. But within a week, under immense pressure from the mayor, local business leaders, and the state government to stop the panic, Chief Cole's public stance shifted violently. The investigation was quietly dismantled. Evidence was downplayed. The official narrative of mass hysteria was adopted overnight. The sudden shift in the police department's tone feels less like an investigative breakthrough and more like a desperate attempt to regain control of a chaotic situation. If the mad gasser was not a phantom born of wartime anxiety, then who or what was terrorizing Mattoon? Digging into the archives, two very distinct, very plausible alternate theories emerge from the shadows. Is it possible that the attacks were entirely accidental? The first theory suggests a massive, unspoken industrial cover-up. Mattoon was producing vital machinery for the war effort. The Atlas Imperial Diesel Engine Company and other factories were operating around the clock. The chemical solvents used in these plants, particularly trichloroethylene, are highly volatile. What if one of these plants was venting toxic chemical waste into the night air to avoid daytime scrutiny? Under the right weather conditions, a heavy, toxic vapor cloud could settle low to the ground. It could drift slowly through the residential streets, seeping into the open windows of sleeping families. The sweet smell, the nausea, the paralysis, all are textbook signs of industrial chemical poisoning. The loud humming noises reported by victims could have been the distant sound of factory ventilation fans kicking on in the dead of night. If the local government realized that their war-critical industries were poisoning the citizens, admitting it would have caused a riot. Blaming the symptoms on mass hysteria would be a perfect, seamless cover-up to keep the assembly lines moving. But what if the truth was far more sinister? What if the footprints and the slash screens were exactly what they appeared to be? This leads us to the second, most compelling hidden pattern. The theory of the rogue chemist. For decades, a quiet rumor circulated among the older residents of Mattoon, a name whispered but never officially recorded in the police files. The name was Farley Llewellyn. Farley was a local outcast. He was a brilliant, highly educated young man who had studied chemistry at the university level. But he was deeply troubled, struggling with severe mental instability and a profound hatred for the townspeople who shunned him. Farley lived in Mattoon during the attacks. More importantly, he lived in a house perfectly situated near the epicenter of the initial gassings. Farley had a private laboratory in his home. He had the knowledge, the materials, and the access to synthesize toxic, paralyzing gases. He was known to wander the streets late at night. Did a brilliant, disturbed mind decide to use the town of Mattoon as a testing ground for homemade chemical weapons? Did he wander the dark streets, pumping solvents through the screens of his sleeping neighbors, watching from the shadows as they woke in paralyzed terror? The deepest secrets are often found in what is missing. When you look for the police files regarding Farley Llewellyn, you find nothing. His name is absent from the official reports of 1944, but local historians and later investigators uncovered a suppressed reality. Long after the panic subsided, witnesses came forward with stories that had been ignored by the authorities. Neighbors of Farley Llewellyn reported that during the 2 weeks of the attacks, they frequently heard loud explosions and smelled noxious, sweet chemical odors pouring from his makeshift laboratory. Even more damning, local records suggest that shortly after the attacks abruptly stopped in mid-September, Farley Llewellyn was quietly removed from Mattoon. The attacks ceased completely on September 13th. Around this exact same time, Farley's family, wealthy and influential in the local community, allegedly committed him to a mental institution far away from the town. The timing is impossibly precise. Just as the police declared the entire event a hallucination, the most capable suspect in the city was silently sent away. Think about the implications. If the police knew that a local, mentally unstable man with a chemistry background was behind the attacks, why cover it up? The answer lies in the volatile environment of 1944. A panic was already tearing the town apart. Armed mobs of vigilantes were roaming the streets with shotguns, ready to kill anyone acting suspiciously. If the police announced they were looking for a specific local man, a lynching was almost guaranteed. Furthermore, Farley's family had deep financial ties to the community. Perhaps Chief Cole realized that revealing the truth would cause more bloodshed than the gas itself. By declaring the event a case of mass hysteria, the police neutralized the vigilantes. The town felt foolish, but they went back to sleep. The panic evaporated. The problem was solved, not by catching a criminal, but by erasing him from the narrative. The footprints were swept away. The slash screens were repaired. The chemically soaked cloth was lost to the archives. The phantom was declared a myth. When we look back at history, we crave clean, definitive answers. We want to believe that experts are always right, that the archives hold the truth, and that monsters are only products of our imagination. The diagnosis of mass hysteria is a comforting blanket we pull over our heads to make the unknown seem rational. But history is rarely clean. It is messy, full of human errors, cover-ups, and shadows that refuse to be explained away. The people of Mattoon in 1944 were not naive. They were tough, practical individuals living in a hard era. They knew what they smelled. They knew what it felt like to lose control of their own limbs. Perhaps the official psychologists were right. Maybe it was nothing but the collective anxiety of a wartime nation. manifesting as a phantom scent in the dark. Maybe it was simply a series of industrial accidents, covered up by the smoke of factory chimneys and the urgent demands of war. Or maybe the people who lived through it saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe, for 2 quiet weeks in September, a very real, very human monster walked the streets of Mattoon, armed with a makeshift weapon, standing just inches away from sleeping families. The truth is buried somewhere in the soil of Illinois. But tonight, when you lock your doors, and when you ensure the windows are shut tight against the dark, ask yourself one question. If the sweet smell of decaying flowers drifts into your room, and your legs suddenly refuse to move, will you believe it is all just in your mind?